Good evening, everyone. It is your girl, Marcie Thomas, coming to you live from ATL with another episode of Live Well Sister. Well, I'm saying live because I'm recording live, but you are going to be watching this in a replay. So I just thank you for being here and being willing to come on in the room, as we like to say here, and enjoy this wonderful conversation. And if you saw that very last slide, it said we're living with joy. And today we're actually going to be speaking with Joy, and that's Dr. Joy Harden Bradford of Therapy for Black Girls. So get excited for this wonderful conversation that I've been waiting quite a while to have with Dr. Joy, because I am a fan of her work, as I'm sure many of you are as well. And I can't wait to dive into this conversation and talk about her, the work that she does, and Sisterhood Heals, as we know is something that we can all learn more about and how we can be a part of embracing one another in sisterhood. So without any further delay, Dr. Joy Harden Bradford is a licensed psychologist and the host of the wildly popular and award-winning mental health podcast, Therapy for Black Girls. Her work focuses on making mental health topics more relevant and accessible for Black women, and she delights in using pop culture to illustrate psychological concepts. She has been named by Glamour as a game changer for her work in the mental health field. Now, she received her bachelor's degree in psychology from Xavier University of Louisiana, her master's in vocational rehabilitation counseling from Arkansas State, and her PhD in counseling psychology from the University of Georgia. Her work has been featured in many places, to include Essence, Oprah Daily, the New York Times, and so many other places. And like me, she lives in the Atlanta area with her husband and two sons. So without any further delay, let's welcome Dr. Joy Harden Bradford to Live Well Sister. Welcome, Dr. Joy.
Thank you so much for having me, Marcie. I'm excited to chat with you.
Yes. And as I mentioned to you before we came on, I've been waiting for a while. So this is a great opportunity for everyone to be able to hear from you. So, Dr. Joy, of course, we know you from the wonderful work that you do with Therapy for Black Girls, the podcast, the website, some of the events that you've held, and of course, Sisterhood Heals as well. But I want to know a little bit about Dr. Joy. So what is it that led you to want to go into the field of mental health and serving sisters specifically?
Ooh, great question, Marcie. So I often tell people that I feel like my love for human behavior and like my curiosity about why we do the things that we do started on my grandmother's porch in Louisiana. So I would spend quite a bit of time outside with her, kind of just people watching and like paying attention to what was happening. So I'm from a very small town in Louisiana. So, there's not very much to do besides sit on the porch and like pay attention to what's happening. And then I had the opportunity to take a psychology class in high school and instantly fell in love. I did not know before then that there was a field that you could go into to study like human behavior and like why we make certain decisions and what makes us tick. And so I had the opportunity to take that class in high school and then went to Xavier as a psych major. I originally thought that I wanted to be a psychology professor, but then I had the opportunity to like do an understudy program and then was like, I actually don't think this is my ministry. But then I had a chance to shadow a therapist in New Orleans. And then I realized like, oh, feels much more aligned with what I would like to do in the ways that I feel like I, kind of show up in the world. And so after I found out about therapy and being a therapist, that has kind of been my career path ever since. With your question around like serving sisters specifically, I often say like nobody ever told me that I couldn't. And I felt like that is where I was really called to serve. I come from a large family of women. So my mom actually has 6 sisters. I have like 20 plus first cousins that are girls. And so I feel like being around Black women is something that, I've been doing for much of my life. And also once I got to grad school and realized like the numbers and the data that talks about how much less likely it is that Black women would actually seek out services, the history of racism and discrimination in the field, it felt really important for me to use the knowledge and the skills that I had developed in training and to serve a community that means a whole lot to me.
I love that. I love that. And I kind of like you. Brown Girl Collective exists because of my love for Black women ever since I was a little girl and reading I'm an only child and don't have all
Mm,
those aunts and cousins like you do. But I loved reading Ebony and Essence and looking at the beautiful
yes.
Black women and just really embracing what it means to be a woman and all of that. So I can definitely concur with that and understand how that would have happened. So,
Hmm.
fast forward several years, and you were saying in the book, you talk about how you were moved to start therapy for Black girls, actually, after watching um, Black Girls Rock.
Yeah.
So, how was that a really inspirational thing for you?
Yeah, so I was watching it on TV, and I think the award show had been in existence before, but maybe this was the first year it was on BET. I'm not quite sure, but I had never seen the show before. And so instantly I was like, "Oh my gosh, like this thing exists just for us." And it was so beautiful to see women from all walks of life, celebrities, educators, healthcare professionals, like all coming together to really give each other their flowers. And you could tell, like, even through the TV screen, the energy was really palpable. And so I thought to myself, like, oh, it would be really cool to capture some of the same energy for Black women as it relates to mental health. So I got on GoDaddy.com that night,
I love
and
it.
searched up therapy for Black girls, and the domain was available. And so I originally started therapy for Black girls as a blog. So I was writing about different topics, like how to really make the most of your support system, how do you actually find a therapist, like what kinds of questions do you want to ask them. So it started as a blog, and then I added the podcast and the directory in 2017.
Wow. And look at how far it's gone. You didn't imagine that when you started it, did you?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I never intended for like this to be my job. Like it's very cool that this is what I get to do full time. But before I was a director of the counseling center at Clark Atlanta University. And so I started therapy for Black girls just as like a side project to get more information out about mental health. And then it has really just taken off.
I love it. I love it. And you never know, what you're thinking of and what God has planned for you, two
Okay.
totally different things.
Exactly. Exactly.
So I love that. Now, Sisterhood Heals specifically, we want to get into the book, which has been out for, I realized when I was looking it up earlier, it's been out for a couple of years. I've actually
Mhm.
had it for a couple of years. So, I've been waiting for a while to talk to you, right? But yes, I love it. Have the hardback here. It is also out in a paperback as well. But
Mhm.
just in deciding, okay, you're doing therapy for Black girls. You have this wonderful, robust community, which we'll talk a little bit about that, as we talk through some of the themes in the book. But then you, of course, this wonderful podcast. But what was it that led you to actually want to write Sisterhood Heals?
So, Marcy, I felt like at some point in my career, I would write a book. I wasn't sure like what the book would be about, but I figured at some point I would write a book. And so I had conversations with like literary agents who thought like, "Hey, are you going to write a book? Like, what are you going to write about?" But I never knew. So I had the conversations, but no, they never really went anywhere. And then I had a conversation in 2020. So a literary agent I had talked with before, Rebecca Gradinger, who is my agent, she circled back and said, "Hey, just want to check in, like what's going on? Have you given any more thought to a book?" And I was actually preparing for our first in-person event for Therapy for
Mm,
Black girls, which was going to be called Sisterhood Heals.
got it.
And so, of course, we know what happened in 2020 was the pandemic, and so we had to cancel the plans for the actual live event. And so, in talking with my agent, she said, "Well, what kinds of things were you planning to cover that weekend? Like, what did you really want that to be?" And that really became the outline for Sisterhood Heals. And so, it really, again, God has plans for what will happen with your life. I had not intended to necessarily write about sisterhood, but it did make sense when I look at like the landscape of the work that I've done. I read talk with you about my family, and I do feel like sisterhood is at the core of so much of the work that we do at Therapy for Black girls, and has been life-saving for so many people, including me. And so it felt really right that the first book would be about sisterhood.
Yes, and a good book that it is. I have notes, but I like to talk them off the cuff because I have actually read the book and I know what's
Hmm.
in it. But
Yeah.
yes, and it's so powerful because especially we think of the last, shoot, probably 20 years at this point. Oftentimes we're seeing things in the media because we know the media, and then even popular culture, which you dive into a lot on your podcast, that don't necessarily make sisterhood look like it's a real thing.
Mm-hmm. You are so right about that, Marcie. And I don't think that that's true, right? Of course, just like anybody, like everybody's not going to get along. But I agree with you that there has been this narrative that has been built in the media that Black women can't get along, and that, it really is like a crabs in a barrel kind of situation. But I think actually, the truth of the matter is that Black women are often riding for each other in ways that I think other people just don't even see. And I think that happens in both our smaller, more intimate circles. So the people that are actually like in our friendship circle, but I think it happens on a larger scale, which is what I refer to as a global sisterhood. Like I think that there are ways that we look out for one another even without knowing each other's names. Like you share a glance in the grocery store, or you see somebody passing in the airport and you give them a compliment. Like I think that sisterhood shows up in both small and larger ways.
And I love that. And the fact that you do talk about the global sisterhood in the book, because oftentimes we might think of, just like you said, our little communities or, the people who are in our family or people we work with. But sisterhood goes so much deeper. And I love the fact that you incorporate that into your work as well as in the book, because it allowed me, I'll speak for myself, to just look at things differently. I mean, of course, Brown Girl Collective, obviously it's about more
Right.
than just a small group, and we do have women from around the world who tap in, but everybody doesn't understand what that means, to be a support, not just to the people who are close to your vest, but also thinking of sisterhood in broader terms.
Hmm. Exactly.
So that's good stuff, Dr. Joy. So, but just thinking of the healing aspect, because we know what it means to be in a sisterhood, or many of us should know what that means, whether it's a sorority or, your family, the people you grew up with, whatever the case may be. But the healing part is another aspect that I don't think many of us have thought about. So, what is it about sisterhood that is a healing, or could be potentially a healing balm for us?
So the other thing that we haven't talked about very much, but that is very present in the book, is my love of group therapy. And so Sisterhood Heals, the book actually kind of takes what I know about group therapy and kind of maps that on to our sister circles, right? And so in being somebody who has practiced group therapy, I actually see a lot of similarities from group therapy in our sister circles. And one of the main ones is that being a part of a sister circle, being a part of a therapy group really allows you to realize that you are not alone with anything that you may be feeling or experiencing. And I think that that is one of the most powerful pieces of sisterhood, is being really known and seen by somebody else, right? Because I think a lot of times we are sitting in silence and maybe sometimes even shame with this thing that's happening with us, or an experience that we've had, and we just cannot believe that anybody else would understand what we're feeling. And so
Right.
being able to be in a sister circle or being a part of a group allows you to say that thing and realize, like, oh my gosh, I'm not the only one. And I think it's important to note that we may not all have the same experience, right? Like my experience of grief may be related to the death of a loved one. Your experience of grief may be related to the loss of some dream that you
Mhm.
had imagined for yourself, but
Mhm.
we can connect over the experience of grief. And so being a part of a circle, being a part of a community really allows you to realize that you're not alone with anything that you're feeling.
Yes, and that's so good. And you do mention, and I have tapped into your Three for Thursday that you do as an example with
Uh-huh.
Therapy for Black girls. That it is just that, when I've joined it, women, you have topics and women come in there and they talk about topics and things like that. And it is, even though it's not necessarily a formal group therapy, it is a group
Mhm.
therapy session, definitely so. And I think that that is powerful because I don't know. There are certain things, over the course of time, me talking to lots of different women, and we start talking about life experiences, even though, I might be from this place and you're from that place, there are
Yeah.
similarities. and common
Yes.
threads that as Black women we often deal with. So it's so powerful to think of women coming together to heal and talk through these things and being able to be transparent and all those sorts of things.
Agreed. Yeah, and I love it. Something else I talk about in the book is how we often serve as possibility models for one
Mhm.
another. And I think that that happens a lot in the Three for Thursday space that you talked about, because there are things that we just don't even imagine could be possible for our lives until we hear somebody else say it or we see somebody else do it. And so I think that that is one of the ways that this global sisterhood really shows up, is that we can look at what somebody else is doing online and hear them talk on a podcast or see them mentioned in some favorite magazine, and we realize like, oh, that's a
Right.
path I could follow too. I never would have imagined that. And so I think that that's a really important aspect of sisterhood as well.
Yes, it definitely is. But, I mean, let's just keep it real. Sisterhood isn't always easy to find for a multitude of reasons
Yeah.
because people may have been burned along the way, or as you talk about in the book, it might be somebody in your family who's put bad ideas about what it means to have women as friends. So I talk a little bit about that, about because as you say in the book many times, yes, I'm going back to childhood. Yes, I'm going back to the early stages. But it is many times the things that happen to us as young people that define whether or not we even consider true sisterhood an option for ourselves.
Yeah, I really appreciate you going there, Marcy, because I start the book with our experiences of childhood and how often our messages about other Black women come from the women in our family. So if we have seen mom and aunties and grandmothers have good experiences with other Black women, then we are likely to replicate that and believe that is possible for ourselves. But on the other hand, and a lot of us, I think, have this experience where mom or auntie or grandmother has said, you got to be careful around other women. Like, you can't trust them with your partner. You got to be mindful. Like, you can't share all of your resources because there won't be enough left for you. And so I think many of us, even if we don't believe that, like on the surface, in our subconscious, I think it shows up in a lot of spaces, right? And so we look at people, if there's a new Black woman in the workspace, we're kind of like holding them at arm's length because we're not sure, like, okay, what's going on here? Are you trying to take my spot? Kind of thing. And we get those messages really early. As a part of writing the book, I did several focus groups and talk with women about the experiences and the conversations that they had with their moms and other women in their families about not trusting other women or talking about other girls as fast, right?
Mhm.
And so there is this separation that kind of starts in childhood that we, I think, don't even realize we are carrying into our older ages. And so a lot of that does actually start in childhood. And so I encourage us to pay attention to the messages that we are giving young girls in our lives about sisterhood. And are we actually appropriately and healthily modeling that for young people in our lives?
Thank you for sharing that because it is something I had to kind of think back about, my own upbringing, and I don't really remember hearing a lot of things like that, but I know that it does happen. I've heard other friends
Hmm.
talk about,
Uh-huh.
how their mother, what I mean, and I mean, come on now, we do have to use wisdom.
Of course, of
Things that
course.
we do, but I mean, just to have like a blanket idea that I can't be friends with women or women aren't trustworthy or all of that, that
Right.
is something that oftentimes can be problematic and keep us from having really good relationships with people.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, we don't know like what kinds of things and how many blessings we are blocking for ourselves because we are staying held by these things that we don't even realize we are believing. And so I think it's important to really interrogate some of the beliefs that we get from childhood to see where if they're actually of service to us. And I think for a lot of like our moms and grandmothers, like that came from a particular place, right? So experiences with racism in a lot of contexts, there was only one black woman who could kind of rise to the top. And so a lot of what we've been taught developed as a survival skill for people who are older than us. But in our current state, in today's day and time, does it make sense to still hold on to those things when we know a lot of that is not actually true?
Right, right. And I love you throw yourself into the narrative as well because there's an instance of someone who's now a long-term friend of yours who maybe you had a feeling about a long time ago based upon preconceived notions or we can pass judgment on people and then realize later on be like, oh,
Hmm.
So I love that you include your own stories in that to
Yeah.
show that you're not just telling us how we could do better and think better and broaden our minds, but you also have had to do that yourself.
Yeah, it's so funny because I actually just saw my friend. So it's my friend Nicole. I just saw her on Saturday, right? So she is one of my best friends. We have boys who are the same age. She's also here in Atlanta. And I just saw her this weekend. And I in the book I write about, she's somebody who has been a dancer all of her life. And
Mm,
so I saw her this summer before, I think our junior year at like all of these different camps in Louisiana. And she would always be like dancing all on guys. And I was like, ooh, this is like the fast girl that my
mm,
mama told me about, right? And so had I not like been open to changing my ideas about what it meant to like dance with people, like now that's pretty innocuous, but at the time it was something I believed. But had I not been open to examining that and really allowing myself to get to know her, I would have missed out on one of the best friends I've had in my entire life. So I think it's really important again to really let go of some of those things that we're holding on to for no reason in particular.
mhm. Absolutely. And of course, we talk about the groups and coming together with the groups, but usually it starts with individuals. So I was talking to a friend of mine earlier about the book, and she's like, "Oh, is it all just about healing?" And stuff like, yes, but it's a process, because we have different things that happen in terms of our friendships, how to develop new friendships, what to do when a friendship isn't going the way that we would like for it to go. So I love, Dr. Joy, that in the book you talk about all of those things because, as we get older, sometimes it is hard because we're not automatically placed in situations that are going to put us in someone's atmosphere. So I'm thinking some
Right.
of my closest friends are from like elementary school and junior
Mm-hmm.
high, but going into a workplace, you might, maybe not. And then as you get older and older, and now that some of us are working from home, that isn't happening.
Yeah.
So just the whole concept of even making friends,
Mm-hmm.
you find that a lot of women find that challenging.
Oh, absolutely. I feel like that is probably one of the most frequently asked questions anytime I do like a three for Thursday or somebody writes into the email address. Like that is something that I think a lot of people are struggling with. I mean, I'm sure Marcie, you've also paid attention to all of
Mm,
the conversations around like loneliness and like how the Surgeon General is describing that as an epidemic now. And so I think it is a real struggle for people to find people that they like connect with, that are reliable and consistent and that really they can grow with. And so I think making friends is not always an easy thing. But the piece of advice that I give most often is to look in the background of your life to
mm,
see if there's somebody with a little bit of effort who could move to the foreground.
I
And
love
so
that.
what I mean by that is, is there like a sister you see in yoga class, or you realize like, oh, you always run into her in the carpool line, and you kind of exchange, pleasantries, but it hasn't gone any further. What would it be like to say, hey, do you want to grab a smoothie after we're done with yoga? Or would you like to grab lunch after we drop the kids off? And just taking an opportunity to have a connection with somebody. I
Mm,
think a lot of us are just really, really afraid of rejection. And so
right.
it feels very awkward to put ourselves out there in that way, but you don't know who could become somebody that's really significant to you unless you put yourself out there. So I think taking a chance and, being open to connecting with somebody new is really important in us making new friends.
I love that because just a quick story. Not too long ago, there's one of the guests that I interviewed who lives in Atlanta, and I actually interviewed her twice, and we made a connection. And we recently went out to eat, and pretty
I
soon we're
love
going to
it.
be going to an event over at the High Museum, the art museum. So it's like we're starting to
Uh-huh.
formulate that relationship, but it could have been just
See.
like, okay, interview's over, like we're done.
Right.
But
Yes, I
you know,
love that.
you just never know how you will
You
find people.
don't. And I love that you all are taking it like very slow, but like increasing in activity, right? So we
Mm,
met very briefly to do like a lunch, and now we're going to something that is like a little bit more time spent together. And I typically tell people, to keep your expectations realistic, right?
mm,
Like this could be somebody who becomes like a new BFF, or it could just be somebody that you enjoyed a lunch with, right? But that doesn't mean that you don't put yourself out there.
mhm. And I love the idea of putting yourself out there because if you don't, just like those of us who are looking for the perfect mate. Like, there comes a point in time you got to put yourself out there.
You got to do a little bit of, you would do a little bit of work on yourself. Yes, you got to do some putting yourself out there.
Yes, yes. And also, in putting yourself out there, understanding that putting yourself out there doesn't necessarily mean putting yourself all the way out there when you're trying to make friends. And
Yes.
so,
Yeah, I mean, because you do want to be mindful that you don't come across as somebody who's desperate, so to speak, right? Because I think when you like exude this desperation, that feels like a lot to
mm,
people. And so, you know, again, like you use this example with your new friend, like you do things that are like short quantities. You share a little bit about yourself and you see if they can handle that. They share some about them. Like it really is almost like dating in a lot of ways, right? Where you are kind of incrementally getting to know people, but not giving everybody or giving someone like all of your information too soon, because that often is off-putting for people.
yes, yes. Yeah, it is like dating. I didn't think about it till I read the books. Like,
Uh-huh.
we are dating each other right now.
It
So
is kind of like that. Yes.
that's neat. But on the other side of that, oftentimes, we may, if you're blessed to meet people that you connect with and, you develop these relationships, also understanding that sometimes you might find that the relationship doesn't work. And you talk about that in the book as well, that sometimes,
Mhm.
like in dating, you have to break up
Yes.
the person
Yes.
that has now become your friend. And that I love that you give us some tips and some ideas, because throughout the book there are like questions that you ask, as well as maybe giving us words to use if we're not sure how to say something. But talk about the friendship breakup as well, because that can be kind of challenging for people.
Yeah, I'm really glad that we are spending more time talking about friendship breakups because I think that these are very painful experiences for women in particular, right? I think that so much of our socialization and like the way that we show up in the world is often connected to the people we spend the most time with. And so when there is a rupture, when a relationship ends, it is very, very difficult and painful. And I think we don't often have a lot of resources, a lot of language to talk about friendship breakups, which is why it was important for me to write about it in Sisterhood Heals, because they can be just as painful and disruptive to our lives as a romantic relationship. And
Mhm.
because we don't do a lot of talking about it, people don't often understand or really acknowledge the grief that comes with a friendship breakup. But you have to go through that same, allowing yourself to be sad, feeling a little leery of trusting new friends, not quite sure how to, if you find yourself in the same space with this person, how do you act? Like all of
Right.
those same things are applicable to a friendship breakup. And I think that there is the additional layer of when we are so close with someone like we typically are with a close girlfriend, like we've created like our own interior worlds with this person. So there's a shared language. They know where all the bodies are buried, so to
Right.
speak. And so when this relationship ends, then that whole world that you created together ceases to exist. And so that is really painful and really, requires some time to rebuild from and to grieve appropriately.
And that is so true, because oftentimes we're closer to our girlfriends than we are with our partner,
Yes.
because there's things you
Yes.
might tell your girl that you're not necessarily going to tell the guy,
Exactly.
or whomever you're dating. You're not always going to tell that person those things. So yes, it
Right.
is difficult, and I think we do need to have those conversations, because I feel like just in other relationships sometimes people stay because there's this level of comfort within that
Mhm.
relationship. And then, but if it gets to a point where, maybe you're growing in a different direction, like there's an example you give in the book of someone who like had a job change, changed her
Yes.
way she was relating in terms of religion and spirituality, and all these things are going on at the same time. And her friends are like, but that's something that can happen. And how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I'm glad you called attention to that, Marcy. So, there are three times, and again, thinking about these focus groups that I did for the book, there are three experiences that I have found that cause some tension in friendships. So, one is the career advancement or promotion that happens for one person, maybe not the other. When somebody has a baby or brings a child into the family. And then the third is when somebody gets engaged or married. And I have found that this can cause some tension in relationships, I think largely due to us not actually sharing how we feel. Right.
Mhm.
And so, in the example of somebody getting engaged or married, I think it activates a lot of not chosen first
Mhm.
wounds for people, and they don't realize that that's what's happening, and so then they start acting out in all these what appears to be weird ways, but it really is an attempt to protect themselves, right? So the person who shows up to the bridal shower an hour late,
Mhm.
or who, mistakenly orders the wrong bridesmaid's dress, right? Like a lot of times those are just subconscious ways of, really acting out this wound that you're trying to protect yourself from. But I think if we can kind of put our big girl pants on and have some difficult conversations, typically our relationships are much better for it. So, what would it be like maybe instead of, acting out in all of these ways that I just talked about? What would it be like to say, hey, I'm really excited that you've just gotten engaged. I'm really looking forward to celebrating this with you. And I feel some sadness about the fact that this hasn't happened for me yet. Right.
Right.
And I think that there is enough space for both of those things to be true. Now, you might not want to have this conversation on the day your friend
Right.
gets engaged, right? Like
Right.
we want to be mindful of those kinds of things.
Right.
But if it is a true loving relationship, it should be able to handle a conversation like that. And so I think it's really important for us to be more open and honest about the ways that we are feeling in friendship so that we can get through difficult times. I think we often run away from conflicts or run away from like these more difficult feelings that we are experiencing. But the truth is that if we can share those things and talk about it as a friendship, then the friendship actually is much stronger on the other end. But we have to be brave enough to say it first.
I love that. And as you were describing that, and even as I was reading it in the book, it's like communication is key. I mean, we hear that, it's
Yeah.
cliche to say communication is key, but it really is. And
Yeah. It's
so,
important.
just being able to people to have the right tools to be able to have like open and honest communication. That's
Right. Right. Hmm.
And so like in your group situations, with Three for Thursday and some of the other things that you do, are these some of the things that you like to teach women how to do to have difficult conversations? Because that's what these are.
Hmm.
Because oftentimes we don't do that. It's easy to just like brush it over, but be seething on the inside, and then something happens and you blow up,
Yep.
or you just
Yep.
stop talking to the person.
Yeah.
But being able to communicate
Yeah,
what.
and I think that that is one of the things that, we often do kind of practice this skill without calling it practice in a space like Three for Thursday or in our sister circles. Like typically these relationships feel safe enough for us to try out some of these things that might feel more difficult in spaces that don't feel as safe. And so what is it like to say to someone, I actually don't agree with what you just said, right? Like that may feel really scary in a different kind of situation or setting. But if there is a level of safety, if we've built a level of trust with one another, I should be able to say that to you and you not like fly off the handle. But we can actually talk about what you disagree with, right? And so I think in spaces like Three for Thursday and in our sister circles, those are great opportunities for us to practice skills like that that we can also use in other places of our lives.
That's so true. That's so true. Because once you know the skill,
Mm-hmm.
you practice it. But
Exactly.
but it is hard because there's this part of us, and I mean, I'll speak for myself and others that are watching. Sometimes you just want to keep the peace, so to speak. And in keeping
Mm.
the peace, sometimes it might be the peace in the relationship on the surface, but you might not have peace within.
Absolutely. I was definitely going to say that, Marcie, right? Like it is external peace, but internally there is chaos, right? And so any relationship that causes or is the result of you like having internal chaos all the time is probably not a relationship that is actually one that allows you to thrive. Now, of course, there will be disagreements and sometimes it may feel unsteady, but can you actually say the thing that you need to say and vice versa, right? Like, are you also contributing to the environment where this other person could tell you like, hey, I don't agree with this, or I feel a little intimidated, or whatever it is that needs to be said. I think it is something that we are all responsible for creating an environment where those kinds of conversations can happen.
Yes, yes. Another thing I love that you talk about in Sisterhood Heals is when you have like a group of sisters, and you mentioned some of my favorites in there. You talk about, Insecure,
Yes.
ladies of Insecure. You talk about the women of Girlfriends. Now, you didn't mention Living Single, but yeah, that's
I
another
know,
one.
you know what, Marcie? That is so funny because recently I've been thinking that was a glaring miss in the book for me not to bring in Living Single.
But yes, but I mean, those were women that we got to see on television and kind of watch them
Hmm.
go through a lot of ins and outs and changes in their relationships, and see how there are oftentimes, especially in a group, if it's not just, two of you, if it's a larger group, how people kind of fall into certain roles within those groups. So talk a little bit about that, because I found that pretty interesting.
Yeah, so I love that you share that, Marcy, because I love using pop culture like that because I think it allows us to see ourselves in these characters in a way that like doesn't make us defensive, right? So we can talk about like Molly and Issa and like what happened in their friendship, and it may be similar, or there may be themes of it in our own relationships, but when we talk about it with them, there's a little bit of distance, and so I think it allows us to kind of grasp these concepts a little easier. But I talk about that often in friendship circles we fall into one of four roles. So there is the leader, which is kind of exactly like it sounds like. The leader is usually the person who is primarily responsible for the circle continuing to move. So if there's a trip happening, they're the one saying, okay, everybody send me your money, I'm putting down the deposit kind of thing. That is typically the leader in the group. The wallflower is the person in the group who doesn't often say a lot, but when they do speak,
Mhm.
everybody kind of stands at attention because there's typically great information there. The firecracker is the person who kind of will say the thing that nobody else wants to say. And sometimes they have some tact and sometimes not, but they definitely will address the elephant in the room. And the peacemaker, who is the person that if there's been a falling out or some tension, they will be the ones to try to get everybody together and talk it through. And these are not concrete roles. So sometimes you will be one person in one circle and somebody else in a different circle, and it's not like a one is better than different or less than. It really is more about how you show up in the circle and what kinds of things you may need to ask for some additional support. So for example, like the leader we've already talked about is like the person who's kind of doing all the planning and very responsible, and that may be a strength for them, but what does it mean if they start to feel resentful because nobody else is doing any of the leading,
Right.
right? And so a growth edge for the leader may be to ask for some more support or to say, hey, can somebody step in to help me do X, Y, Z? And so I think it really is important for you to kind of know your role so that you can figure out like how you need to show up and how you need to ask for support. And if you're interested in figuring out who you are in your sister circle, I have a quiz that will allow you to figure out your role. So if you go to sisterhoodheals.com/quiz, you can take the quiz. And I love that like so many people had the quiz and then like they shared it in the group chat or got
Mhm.
together for brunch to talk about it, because that is what I want you to do, is to have conversations about who you all are in your sister circles.
Yes, and that is so good, because as you know, as I was reading, I'm trying to think, and you talked about Joan. Like, we'll just use Girlfriends as the example.
Uh-huh.
It seemed like Joan was the leader, but sometimes maybe not, and I think it
Yes.
could be situational as well, just depending on what's going on.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, there was the one scene, and I won't spoil the book for you, so I
Right.
won't tell you everything. But I think that there was one glaring example for me that was like very clear that Joan had like taken being the leader of the circle too seriously.
Right.
And so do pay attention in the book to get the rest of that story. But I just love Girlfriends for so many reasons. I felt
Oh
like
yeah.
they showed so many dynamics, like the whole situation with her and Tony when Tony got engaged. We saw
Right.
Joan acting out in lots of ways. So
Right.
lots of examples.
Right, exactly,
Hmm.
exactly. So, and I still watch Living Single.
Of
I
course.
still watch Girlfriends, because there are so many things that even though I don't have a circle like that, but there are still things
Hmm.
to learn, from watching and
Absolutely.
seeing those different types of dynamics in those sister circles. But that also
Yeah.
brings up something. Just me saying I don't have that. Oftentimes, it might be one friend or maybe two friends, but how important do you feel that it is to have a tribe, so to speak,
Mhm.
allows us to have people we can support them and they can be of support to us, because the reality of it is that nobody can be all things to all people. And
Mhm.
I think that it's important. So how do you feel about having that tribe?
Yeah, I think it's really important, but I don't think the tribe has to be large, right? Like
Right.
if it is just two other people, I think that that's totally fine because, like you said, like we can't be everything to everybody, and I think it allows you to share the wealth when there are more people in the circle, right? So there's times where I'm really maybe up and I can do more supporting of other people, and there's times where I'm not feeling so great, and then other people can support me. So I think the larger it is, the better in some ways because there are more people to kind of, take their turn, so to
Right.
speak. But I don't think it has to be a lot of people. I think you can still form some very, very solid and important relationships, even with just one or two other people.
Yeah, that's good. That's good to hear. Because
Mhm,
I'm
yes.
relatively new to Atlanta, for example, because that's the thing. I'm a person
Yeah.
that, I'm originally from Ohio. I was in the military. I have moved a lot. And so not
Hmm.
having a tribe in a traditional sense of the word has a lot to do with that, because,
Yeah.
having to move and readjust and, reform new relationships. So, just looking at the concept of sisters and healing and having that group, any suggestions for people like me who have moved a lot and trying to, really formulate those types of relationships that you really can be there for one another?
Yeah, I think it's important to go where groups already exist around things that you may be interested in. So if there is, if you're part of a faith or spirituality circle, then is there like a smaller group that you can join there? Or can you volunteer in some ways to get connected to other members? We talked about, so many of us do this through sororities. There are other women's organizations that you can join, but there are also just random like interests group. So, there's a lot of talk about like running clubs right now. So if that is of interest to you, I think participating in the kinds of things that you already would be interested in, and then going and doing those things with the idea that you'll likely meet other people who are also interested in those things. And again, keeping your expectations realistic, but you are more likely to meet people that you have more in common with when you do things that you're already interested in.
I love that. I love that. And you do talk about this in the book. So these questions aren't random. Based on things in the book, but that is the reality of my life. And in the almost 4 years that I've lived here, that is something, I'm at church. I do have some things that I do to volunteer. And then I am in a sorority, Sigma Gamma Rho. I know you're AKA.
Uh-huh.
So we're D9 sisters. But
Yes.
but yes, it definitely makes a difference. But even in that, you still kind of have to do some dating, because just because you all are in the same group or doing some of the same things doesn't automatically mean that there's going to be a connection.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that again, the relationship has to grow, right? And so just because y'all are, seeing each other frequently for like a volunteer project or something, that doesn't mean that you're really getting to know them beyond that
Mhm.
project. So again, we need to, put ourselves out there, see who we can trust. And I do think it's important not to feel bad, like you've mentioned, Marcy, like moving just because you don't have people that have like a long history where you've known them since college, like that's great, but there are some people who you meet, within a year that become very, very significant to you. And
Mhm.
so I don't want people to feel bad that like they haven't found this for themselves yet. Like there is always another opportunity to meet people who will love you.
All right. Yes, because you say that in the book. You haven't met everybody
Hmm.
who's going to love you yet. So
Yeah,
that's good. That's
exactly.
good. And it's encouragement for those who might be struggling in that area.
Yeah, yeah.
To see that. So, of course, when we're talking about therapy from that aspect of things, what do you feel besides, well, I know, but for the people who might not know, there are folks who may say, oh, you need to go to one on one therapy. And then there's group therapy. Do you find that people benefit from a combination of the two, or some more than others, or does it just really depend on what the situation is?
Yeah, it does really depend, like a lot of things, right? But I do think that group therapy is something a lot of people don't and haven't considered that actually could be really, really helpful for them, right? Because I think when we hear therapy, we often think about individual, like just me and a therapist working on whatever it is. But group therapy is actually ideal and maybe even preferred for lots of concerns. So, for example, social anxiety. So there's of course great work that you can do with an individual therapist with social anxiety if that's your concern, but a group really kind of like add some gasoline to the healing and the development that you could experience because in real time you are able to learn how to manage any distress that you are feeling in social situations or for people who worry like oh they're thinking negatively of me in a social situation, you can ask this person in real time, like, hey, what are your thoughts about me? Like, that's a part of what happens in group. And so, group is actually my favorite way to practice therapy, just because I think that there is so much that we can learn from one another. And wherever we go, there we are is really, really true in group. So, if you are somebody that has trouble with assertiveness or new people, then being in a group experience is going to really bring that to the forefront for you and allow you to work on those things in a way that just takes much longer in individual therapy, right? Because you're then maybe bringing in examples or you're, telling the therapist about a thing that has happened as opposed to me being able to see it in real time. Like, hey, you are typically somebody who talks a lot in group, but we had a new member today and now you haven't said much. I wonder what that's about, right? And
Right.
so group is actually an incredible way, is like I said, my favorite way to practice, just because I think that there's so much that happens in interpersonal dynamics.
There is, but I can also imagine that it's scary for some people
Of
because,
course. Of
yeah,
course.
depending
I
on
think
what it is.
many of us, it takes a while to even get up the nerves to call an individual therapist, right? And this is
Right.
just one person who you're going to be talking about. So now you're talking about in a room of 8 to 10 strangers that I'm telling all my business to. And of course, that can be a little intimidating, but I just want to call back to our earlier conversation about, there isn't anything that we are alone in feeling. And so there are very likely other people in the group who can connect with exactly what you're feeling. And so I think that that is one of the draws for group therapy, is that even though it may feel a little intimidating and scary at first, it is an incredible way for you to realize that you're not actually alone. And I think it's important to know that you can still like operate at your own pace in groups. So you don't have to go to the first meeting and like share everything. Like you probably likely gonna have to introduce yourself, but you can, pay attention, wait a little while, feel the group out before you decide how much you actually want to share.
I love that. It makes me think of for any of us who have, like seen things in movies where it's a group or thinking of AA or other groups like that
Uh-huh.
where people come
Yeah.
in and, you kind of work your way up to it. It's not a thing where you're expected to come in and just tell, like, tell all your business.
Exactly. And we do have conversations around confidentiality because I think that that is the other thing that feels very uncomfortable,
Mhm.
is like, how can I trust these people won't tell my business? But it's the idea that everybody's sharing. And so we are creating a space where we trust one another to keep everybody's information with inside the group.
Right. Because in some ways, it might be safer than some of these friend groups.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because you are, again, there are conversations around confidentiality, and you typically sign, group agreements, so to speak, that indicate that you are going to keep people's information private.
Because that is important, because being able to be vulnerable and speak your
Hmm.
truth and not feel like you're going to be judged for that I
Right.
definitely can see the advantage of that. Because some friends, even if you're very, very close friends, you tell them certain things, it's like, woo, it's an automatic.
Right.
So I do definitely love the idea of sister circles and being able to do group therapy and just really being of support. Because at the end of the day, it's all about people being able to support one another.
Exactly.
And there's so many different ways that we can do that, which you also share in Sisterhood Heals. You give us a nice list of things and ways that we can support our sisters, whether it's in a one-on-one situation, going all the way up to ways we can support sisters globally. So please share a little bit about that and your thought process behind making sure that was included in the book.
Yeah. So the last part of the book is called Sister Acts. Because I didn't want it to just be like a book that you like read and put on your shelf and like, oh, okay, I did that thing. I really wanted it to be an action oriented like experience. And so I wanted to share things that for people who were like, oh, I want to do this, but I'm not quite sure how to start, to give people very tangible things that they can do to foster a sense of sisterhood, both individually and kind of in their small groups, but also as a part of this global sisterhood. And so I talk about, making sure to like buy to celebrate people's birthdays in ways that maybe they don't typically, right? So even if people say like, oh, my birthday's not a big deal, that you make a big deal of it, not in a way that makes them uncomfortable, but that you really show that you're paying attention and you want them to feel loved and appreciated on that day. I talk about like paying for people's groceries behind them, or the whole like paying it forward kind of thing. Leaving a nice gift basket for somebody who's starting in your office. Lots of little ways that you can really, again, just kind of continue to foster this sense of sisterhood.
And I love the ideas because oftentimes we are creatures of habit and we just do the
Uh
same
huh.
things the same way all of the time. And to be able to do something that's a little bit different, I think that's great. And just like in, a romantic relationship, keep the fires burning. Do some
Exactly. I love that, Marcie. Yes. And again, to our earlier conversation, there is no shortage of books and magazines and things that talk about like how to keep things spicy and,
right.
like all of that in a romantic relationship. But we don't talk about like the love notes that are important in our friendship circles. And so doing the kinds of things that show people we love them when they are friends, I think is just as important for us.
Absolutely. Now I want to go back to the global sisterhood because we start local and we move global. But just thinking about global sisterhood in the book, you give at the very beginning, you give like some history of what sisterhood even meant, like back on in the motherland and how we have moved it forward over time. But I think that sometimes we don't necessarily consider our sisters outside of our immediate communities. But how important is it for us to really think about us as a global sisterhood or a diaspora? How important is it for us to do that as Black women?
Yeah, I think it's really, really important. And I think the places where we see this show up most often are in our online interactions, right? So there's a whole piece in there about digital sisterhood, which I think is a part of global sisterhood, that we are in a lot of ways connected to sisters across the world in ways that we wouldn't have been even like 15 years ago, right? And so I think when we are thinking about like our interactions with people online, there is, I think, a responsibility to approach one another with grace and compassion in a way that we are not often afforded from other people, right? And so when we see somebody like getting clowned online or whatever, do we need to be the 20th person to say something to
Right.
this person, or can we take a step back and say, you know what, this person probably is already feeling awful, I'm just going to take a step back. And I think that the global sisterhood really does show up in those ways.
It definitely does. I'm thinking about, there's so many things. Well, we were talking about Insecure earlier. We know that Amanda Seals is a good example, who was on that show, had
Hmm.
some challenges, and it seemed like at a certain point everybody's just piling on, piling on, piling on, piling
Right.
on. And even if you have whatever feelings that you have, it doesn't mean that you have to be yet another person that piles on.
Exactly. Like, have we not already heard this? We've seen this comment
Right.
12,000 times already. We don't need to see this comment again.
Right. But I think some of that is that people, they just feel, well, I got, I have a right to say what I want to say. And you do,
Yeah.
but
Right.
also consider, because what if the tables turn and one day you're the one?
Yeah. Yeah. It wouldn't feel so good. And
Yeah,
I think that there is a level of care and consideration that we ought to offer to one another just by the mere fact of that we all Black women.
we are Black women. Yes.
Hmm.
And there are a lot of other things. We are not going to get through it all. And that's not the point because we want people to read the book. But I mean, you don't shy away from, things that we might deal with misogyny or misogynoir and how that impacts our relationships. It can
Hmm.
make people you might not want to be around because they have bought into some of these concepts and ideas. I don't know, sis. You don't shy away from that. You don't shy away from colorism, because oftentimes that's the thing that might, color our relationships for one reason or another. So, Dr. Joy, you've done your good work on this book.
Thank you, Marcie. And when people ask me like, what is the book? I talk about it as both a celebration of who we are to one another and like the really good things and the ways that are incredible about how we show up for one another. But it is also a gentle invitation for us to do a better job. And so what you're talking about is, some of those conversations that are not easy for us to have and the things that actually get in the way of us being good sisters to one another. So we got to address the elephant in the room, right? Like we got to talk about the things that are not so pleasant to talk about.
Right, because if we don't, what they say, you can't conquer what you won't confront.
Yes, exactly.
So sometimes we got to deal with those issues and get to the root of them and have those conversations. And it's books like Sisterhood Heals. And yes, this is the hardcover. The paperback looks a little bit differently, but the same stuff on the inside. Yes.
So this is the paperback.
Yes. So yes, look for either or. Look for either or. And it's also been published in the UK, correct?
Yes, and the UK cover looks very similar to this one.
Okay.
Yes.
So how does that feel to have your book like all around the world like that?
It feels very cool. And the coolest thing is being able to have conversations like this, right? Like I said, I didn't want it to just be a book that people read and like put on their shelves. I really wanted us to talk about it. I wanted to be able to start a conversation about sisterhood that then trickles down into lots of different circles. So it feels very, very wonderful, I think, to have so many people talking about the book.
Yes. And of course, we're going to talk about the work that you do anyway, because you do such good work. So how many years of the podcast, Therapy for Black Girls? How many years are we in now?
Ooh, so we started it in 2017. So we are, 8 years? Is that 8 years? Don't check my math, whatever that is. Yeah, 7 years. I think we're celebrating the 7th anniversary of Therapy for Black Girls. And that has been incredible, right? Because I think I started podcasting because I fell in love with the read. So I'm sure many of your community also are fans of that podcast. Like I had a 45-minute commute each way. And so I started listening to a bunch of podcasts and thought, oh, this is really cool. I would love to be able to like share some of the information and thoughts about Therapy for Black Girls in a podcast format. And thankfully I had an in-house producer. So my husband actually has experience as a radio producer. And so I knew I didn't have to like, outsource that. And so it felt like a very low risk for me to try something that's very different. And it just took off. So even before we like announced the first episode, like somebody had found it online and started talking about it. And so it feels like the kind of thing that it like just struck at the right time, and people were really hungry, I think, and ready to have conversations around mental health.
Yes, and congratulations, because 7 years, anytime you do something for any amount of, extended amount of time, it's very powerful that you're doing that, and you stay committed. And every week I get my alerts because I do listen. I do listen. I think I got one yesterday or this morning or whatever. When the new episodes come out and all of that, and it's good stuff. And one thing also in your community, of course we can't talk forever, but one thing in your community I do like that is a multi-generational community. There are things that I will be 58 here in a few days, so I love listening to it. The college student can listen to it, the young mother, everybody can listen to it, because there's something that people can get from it. So I love that you are intentional about making it something that, maybe not every episode, but there's going to be something that every Black woman can tap into.
Yes, I thank you. I appreciate that, Marcie. And happy early birthday. I hope you have a fun celebration plan.
Oh, yeah, I'm partying all month.
I love it.
It's September, but I plan to party all month long. So I'm excited about that. So is there anything that you have coming up anytime, any events or anything that you just want to make sure people tap into that will be happening in the near future with you, Dr. Joy?
No events coming up. We just wrapped up our first therapist summit here in Atlanta last month. which was a lot of fun. We do plan to bring that back in 2025, but no events kind of on the horizon. I'm most excited just about continuing conversations about the book and the podcast, as you mentioned. So would love for people to go to therapyforblackgirls.com and check out the podcast episodes. Like you mentioned, there's a new episode that's released every Wednesday morning. So if you subscribe or follow, then it'll come right to your phone. And to grab a copy of Sisterhood Heals and then talk about it with your circle. So grab one for
Yeah.
yourself and your girls so that y'all can all talk about it. I'd really love that.
Yes, and I would be remiss if I did not mention sign up for Dr. Joy's emails, Sweet Tea Sundays. See, I told you. I told you.
You are all in the community.
I'm all in the community, right? Right. Because I love those emails because there's always so much great information. You know, there's a recap of whatever is happening within the community throughout the week. You know, Dr. Joy shares the TV she's watching, the book she's reading, the articles, the music, whatever. But it's really, yeah, I told you.
Yes. And you can subscribe to that at therapyforblackgirls.com/sweet tea.
Yes, and it's just really good information, and it's you know how sometimes you get an email and it's this long. It's not that.
No, I try to keep it brief.
Right. Yeah. Keep it brief and keep it cutesy.
Exactly.
Keep it cutesy. So thank you so much again, Dr. Joy, for being here. It has indeed been a pleasure. Hopefully, since we both live in the ATL, it won't be the last time we get a chance to chat. And I just am so proud again and excited about all the things that you're doing to support all of us Black girls out here who could use a little therapy, right? We could all use
it. Indeed. Thank you so much, Marcie. This has been so much fun. I appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you. So hold on one second.